There's a curious paradox in our age of expertise. The more advanced degrees someone accumulates, the less they seem to understand about actual human life. I've watched brilliant graduate students explain complex theories about society while remaining utterly baffled by the simple wisdom their grandmothers possess about raising children, maintaining relationships, or navigating daily moral choices. This isn't merely an amusing observation, it reveals something profound about the nature of knowledge itself. Throughout my years at Cambridge, I witnessed an unfortunate transformation in education. We've become enchanted with the idea that all valuable knowledge can be reduced to technical propositions, that wisdom consists merely in accumulating information and applying abstract principles. Yet the grandmother who has never read a single treatise on child psychology often demonstrates a deeper understanding of human nature than the expert with multiple degrees. Today, I want to explore why practical wisdom, the kind possessed by grandmothers, skilled craftsmen, and experienced practitioners, often proves more reliable than the theoretical knowledge prized in our universities. This isn't an attack on learning, but rather a defense of the kind of knowledge that emerges from lived experience, cultural inheritance, and the patient cultivation of judgment through practice. We'll discover why the art of living cannot be mastered through textbooks alone. Chapter 1: The University's Great Deception. The modern university has perpetrated one of the most successful deceptions in intellectual history, convincing us that all meaningful knowledge can be taught through explicit instruction. We've created institutions that treat human wisdom as if it were a technical skill, reducible to methods and formulas that can be transmitted from professor to student like downloading software. I remember conversations with colleagues who genuinely believed that moral judgment could be taught through ethics courses, that political wisdom could be acquired by studying theories of governance, that the art of living could be mastered by reading philosophy. They confused information with understanding, technique with wisdom. The grandmother, by contrast, never makes this mistake. She knows that knowing how to comfort a crying child, judge a person's character, or maintain a household requires something that cannot be found in any textbook. What the grandmother possesses is what I call practical knowledge, the kind of understanding that emerges from participation in the activities of living rather than from theoretical reflection about them. This knowledge is largely tacit, embedded in practices and traditions that have been refined over generations. It cannot be completely articulated because it involves subtle discriminations, contextual judgments, and an intuitive grasp of human nature that develops only through experience. The graduate student, trained to believe that all knowledge must be explicit and systematic, often lacks this practical wisdom entirely. They can recite theories about human behavior but remain helpless when confronted with actual human complexity. They've been taught to approach life as a problem to be solved rather than as an art to be practiced. The grandmother understands that life is not a problem requiring a solution but a predicament requiring navigation. This distinction matters enormously because it affects how we understand education itself. Should universities be technical schools focused on transmitting explicit knowledge, or should they be places where students learn to participate in the great conversation of human culture? The grandmother never attended university, yet she embodies the latter ideal perfectly. Chapter 2: Tradition as Living Wisdom. When a grandmother teaches her granddaughter to cook, she doesn't hand her a recipe book and expect mastery. Instead, she invites the child into the kitchen, demonstrates techniques, shares stories about family meals, and gradually transmits not just culinary skills but an entire way of understanding nourishment, hospitality, and care. This is tradition in its truest form, not dead customs mindlessly repeated, but living wisdom passed through generations of practice. The graduate student, trained to dismiss tradition as mere prejudice or outdated custom, fails to recognize that traditions are repositories of accumulated human experience. Every traditional practice embodies countless experiments, failures, and refinements spanning generations. The grandmother's approach to child rearing, for instance, represents the distillation of centuries of trial and error, modified and adapted through countless contexts but preserving essential insights about human nature. Traditional knowledge differs fundamentally from academic knowledge in its relationship to time and experience. Academic knowledge claims universal validity. It should work anywhere, anytime, for anyone who properly applies the correct method. Traditional knowledge, by contrast, is contextual and relational. It emerges from particular communities dealing with particular challenges over extended periods. It cannot be transplanted wholesale but must be learned through apprenticeship and participation. Consider how a grandmother knows when a child needs discipline versus comfort, when to offer advice versus simply listen, when to intervene versus allow natural consequences to teach their lessons. This knowledge cannot be reduced to psychological theories or parenting manuals. It requires the kind of judgment that develops only through sustained attention to the particulars of human relationships. The Academy's dismissal of such knowledge as unscientific reveals a profound misunderstanding of rationality itself. There are forms of rational activity that cannot be captured by the scientific method or reduced to explicit propositions. The grandmother's wisdom represents one such form, a kind of practical rationality that operates through imagination, sympathy, and cultivated sensibility rather than through analysis and calculation. This traditional wisdom doesn't oppose learning and reflection, it provides the foundation that makes genuine learning possible. The grandmother who has never studied child psychology often understands children better than the expert precisely because her understanding is grounded in sustained attention to actual children rather than abstract theories about childhood. Chapter 3: The Arrogance of Expertise. Now, observe how our culture has elevated theoretical knowledge over practical wisdom, creating a peculiar form of intellectual arrogance. The social scientist who has never raised children presumes to lecture parents about proper child-rearing techniques. The urban planner who has never lived in the communities he redesigns claims authority over neighborhoods with generations of organic development. The education theorist who has never taught a classroom of real children develops curricula that practicing teachers must somehow implement. This represents what I call the rationalist fallacy, the belief that human affairs can be understood and managed through the application of theoretical knowledge alone. The rationalist looks at the grandmother's practices and sees only superstition and inefficiency. Why doesn't she use the latest pediatric research? Why does she rely on bold wives' tales instead of scientific studies? The rationalist cannot see that the grandmother's knowledge operates in a different domain entirely. The grandmother's authority derives not from her ability to cite research but from her demonstrated competence in the actual activities of living. She has successfully raised children, maintained relationships, and navigated the complexities of human community. Her knowledge is tested daily against reality in ways that the graduate student's theoretical understanding never is. When expertise claims universal application, it becomes dangerous. The economist who reduces human behavior to mathematical models, the psychologist who treats complex personalities as collections of measurable variables, the political scientist who believes societies can be engineered according to theoretical principles, all demonstrate the characteristic blindness of technical rationalism. The grandmother knows that human beings are not machines to be operated according to instruction manuals. She understands that every child is unique, that relationships require constant adjustment and sensitivity, that life is full of ambiguities that cannot be resolved through the application of general rules. This understanding makes her a better guide to human flourishing than the expert with advanced degrees but no practical experience. Consider the different approaches to solving problems. The expert begins with theory and attempts to apply it to particular cases. The grandmother begins with attention to the particular situation and draws upon her accumulated experience to discern appropriate responses. The expert's approach often fails because reality refuses to conform to theoretical expectations. The grandmother's approach succeeds because it remains responsive to the actual complexities of human life. This doesn't mean we should reject all expertise or embrace anti-intellectualism. Rather, we need to recover a proper understanding of the relationship between different forms of knowledge and their appropriate domains of application. Chapter 4: Education as Conversation, Not Training. The difference between a grandmother and a graduate student becomes most apparent in their understanding of education itself. The graduate student, products of technical education, believes learning consists in acquiring information and mastering techniques. Education becomes a process of downloading content from expert sources into passive recipients. Success is measured by the ability to reproduce approved answers and demonstrate competence in prescribed methods. The grandmother understands education as something entirely different, as initiation into a way of life, participation in ongoing conversations, and gradual development of judgment through practice and reflection. When she tells stories to her grandchildren, she's not simply entertaining them but introducing them to moral imagination, helping them understand how people have faced challenges throughout history, and cultivating their capacity for sympathy and understanding. This distinction reflects two fundamentally different conceptions of what it means to be human. Technical education treats people as problem-solving machines that can be programmed with the right information and procedures. Liberal education, which the grandmother practices intuitively, recognizes that human beings are conversation partners who must learn to participate thoughtfully in the ongoing dialogue of civilization. The grandmother never confuses learning with mere information acquisition. She knows that wisdom cannot be transmitted like data but must be cultivated through sustained engagement with particular activities and relationships. She doesn't give lectures about moral behavior, she demonstrates it through her actions and invites her grandchildren to participate in morally significant activities. University education has increasingly adopted the technical model, treating students as consumers purchasing credentials rather than apprentices learning to participate in intellectual traditions. We measure educational success by employment outcomes and earning potential rather than by the development of judgment, character, and cultural understanding. This transformation has produced graduates who are technically competent but culturally illiterate, who can perform specialized tasks but cannot engage thoughtfully with the fundamental questions of human existence. The grandmother's approach to education is fundamentally conversational. She doesn't lecture her grandchildren about proper behavior, she engages them in ongoing dialogue about how to live well. She shares stories, asks questions, listens to their responses, and gradually helps them develop their own capacity for moral and practical reasoning. This kind of education cannot be systematized or scaled up because it requires personal attention to particular individuals in specific contexts. Liberal education, properly understood, should resemble the grandmother's approach more than the graduate school's. It should introduce students to the great conversations of human culture, help them develop their capacity for independent judgment, and cultivate their ability to participate thoughtfully in the ongoing enterprise of civilization. This kind of education produces not experts but educated persons, individuals capable of thinking for themselves while remaining responsive to the wisdom embedded in cultural traditions. Chapter 5: The Art of Practical Judgment. Reflect, for a moment, on how differently a grandmother and a graduate student approach moral and practical decisions. The graduate student, trained in theoretical analysis, seeks general principles that can be applied across situations. They want rules, methods, and systematic approaches that promise certainty and consistency. When faced with a particular moral dilemma, they immediately begin searching for the relevant theory or principle that should govern their decision. The grandmother operates through a different kind of reasoning entirely. She possesses what Aristotle called phronesis, practical wisdom or prudence, which enables her to discern appropriate action in particular circumstances. This wisdom cannot be reduced to the application of general rules because it involves sensitivity to context, attention to relationships, and an intuitive grasp of what the situation requires. Consider how a grandmother handles family conflicts. She doesn't consult theories about conflict resolution or apply universal principles of justice. Instead, she draws upon her deep knowledge of the particular individuals involved, her understanding of family dynamics accumulated over decades, and her sensitivity to the subtle factors that textbooks never mention. She knows when to mediate and when to let people work things out themselves, when to be firm and when to be gentle, when to speak and when to remain silent. This practical wisdom develops only through sustained engagement with the activities of living. It cannot be taught through courses or acquired by reading books because it involves forms of knowledge that are largely tacit and contextual. The grandmother who has successfully navigated decades of family relationships possesses insights about human nature that no amount of theoretical study can provide. The graduate student's preference for explicit, systematic knowledge reflects a deeper anxiety about uncertainty and ambiguity. They want clear guidelines that remove the burden of judgment and guarantee correct outcomes. The grandmother has learned to embrace uncertainty as a normal condition of human life. She understands that most important decisions cannot be made mechanically but require the exercise of judgment in situations where the relevant considerations cannot be completely specified in advance. This difference has profound implications for how we understand moral and political life. If we believe that all practical questions can be answered through the application of theoretical knowledge, we will inevitably seek technical solutions to human problems. We will look for policies and programs that can be implemented by experts rather than cultivating the practical wisdom necessary for thoughtful citizenship. The grandmother's approach suggests a different model entirely, one that recognizes the irreducible complexity of human affairs and the necessity of developing practical judgment through participation in particular communities and traditions. This model doesn't promise the false certainty of technical solutions, but it offers something more valuable, the possibility of wisdom adequate to the actual conditions of human life. Chapter 6: The Failure of Social Engineering. Nowhere does the contrast between theoretical expertise and practical wisdom become more evident than in our repeated attempts at social engineering. The last century is littered with well-intentioned programs designed by experts to solve social problems through the application of rational planning. Urban renewal projects that destroyed functioning communities, educational reforms that ignored how children actually learn, welfare systems that undermined the very relationships they were meant to support, all represent the characteristic failures of theoretical knowledge when applied to human affairs. The grandmother would never make these mistakes because she understands something that experts consistently forget: human communities are not machines that can be redesigned according to theoretical specifications. They are living, complex systems of relationships that have developed over time through countless small adaptations and adjustments. The grandmother knows that you cannot simply transplant a successful practice from one community to another because communities differ in ways that cannot be captured by general theories. Consider the disaster of urban renewal in American cities during the mid-20th century. Planning experts looked at older neighborhoods and saw only inefficiency and obsolescence. They couldn't perceive the intricate networks of mutual support, the informal systems of child supervision, the complex relationships between residents and local businesses that made these communities function. Their theoretical knowledge about optimal residential design blinded them to the practical wisdom embedded in organically developed neighborhoods. The grandmother living in such a neighborhood would have understood immediately why the experts' plans were doomed to fail. She knew which neighbors could be trusted to watch children, which local shopkeepers extended credit during difficult times, which informal gathering places served essential social functions. This knowledge couldn't be captured in the planner's blueprints because it existed in relationships rather than in structures. The same pattern appears repeatedly across different domains. Educational experts develop curricula based on theories about how children learn, Ignoring the accumulated wisdom of experienced teachers who understand that every child is unique and that learning cannot be reduced to the mechanical application of pedagogical techniques. Welfare experts design programs according to economic theories about incentives, failing to understand how such programs might undermine the informal support systems that actually help families weather difficulties. The grandmother's skepticism about expert solutions doesn't stem from anti-intellectualism but from a deeper understanding of human complexity. She knows that the most important aspects of human life, love, trust, loyalty, character, cannot be engineered or managed through technical interventions. These emerge from the slow cultivation of relationships and the gradual development of shared understandings within particular communities. This suggests a fundamentally different approach to social problems, one that begins with humility about what can be accomplished through centralized planning and that seeks to strengthen rather than replace the informal institutions through which people actually organize their lives. The grandmother's wisdom points toward solutions that work with rather than against the grain of human nature. Chapter 7: Recovering Practical Wisdom in American Life. How might we begin to recover the practical wisdom that grandmothers possess in our increasingly technocratic society? This question becomes urgent as we witness the proliferation of experts offering solutions to every conceivable human problem while our most basic institutions, families, neighborhoods, local communities, continue to weaken under the pressure of abstract rationalization. The first step involves recognizing that not all important knowledge can be reduced to explicit information or systematic method. We must recover respect for the kind of wisdom that develops through sustained engagement with particular activities and relationships. This means valuing the insights of practitioners over the theories of experts, preferring local knowledge over universal principles, and recognizing that some forms of understanding cannot be taught but must be learned through apprenticeship and participation. American political culture has always contained resources for such recovery. Our constitutional system reflects a profound skepticism about concentrated expertise and a preference for distributed decision-making. The founders understood that political wisdom emerges from the interaction of diverse perspectives rather than from the application of theoretical blueprints. Local government, voluntary associations, and civil society organizations embody this insight in practical form. Yet we've increasingly abandoned this inheritance in favor of technical approaches to governance. We look to federal agencies staffed by experts to solve problems that previous generations would have addressed through local initiative and voluntary cooperation. We seek systematic solutions where our predecessors would have relied on prudent judgment adapted to particular circumstances. The grandmother's approach suggests different priorities entirely. Instead of expanding expert authority, we might focus on strengthening the institutions through which practical wisdom develops and operates. This means supporting families, neighborhoods, and voluntary associations that serve as schools for practical judgment. It means preferring local solutions over centralized programs, gradual adaptation over systematic reform, and practical experimentation over theoretical implementation. In education, this might mean returning to approaches that emphasize formation over information, that treat students as apprentices in cultural traditions rather than consumers of expert knowledge. Schools could become communities where practical wisdom is cultivated through sustained attention to particular texts, problems, and relationships rather than factories for producing technically competent workers. In politics, we might recover the art of statesmanship, the practical wisdom necessary for navigating complex circumstances where theoretical knowledge provides insufficient guidance. This requires politicians who understand their role as practitioners of a demanding art rather than administrators implementing expert recommendations. Most fundamentally, we need to recover confidence in our capacity for practical judgment. The grandmother never doubts her ability to discern appropriate action in particular circumstances because she understands that such judgment develops through practice rather than through theoretical study. Americans have traditionally possessed this confidence, This sense that ordinary citizens can be trusted to govern themselves and manage their affairs without expert supervision. Recovering practical wisdom doesn't mean rejecting all expertise or embracing ignorance. Rather, it means understanding the proper relationship between different forms of knowledge and their appropriate domains of application. The grandmother's wisdom offers a model for how we might live more thoughtfully in a world that increasingly demands technical solutions for fundamentally human problems. Conclusion. The grandmother's superiority over the graduate student isn't a quaint observation about generational differences. It reveals something fundamental about the nature of wisdom itself. In our rush to systematize all knowledge and solve all problems through expert intervention, we've forgotten that the most important aspects of human life cannot be reduced to technical propositions or managed through administrative procedures. The grandmother embodies a different approach to understanding and action, one grounded in sustained attention to particular relationships and circumstances rather than abstract theoretical knowledge. Her wisdom emerges from participation in the ongoing activities of living rather than from reflection about those activities. This practical knowledge proves more reliable than theoretical expertise precisely because it remains responsive to the actual complexity of human affairs. As we face contemporary challenges that resist technical solutions, the breakdown of families, the isolation of individuals, the loss of community, the erosion of trust in institutions, we might learn from the grandmother's approach. Instead of seeking more sophisticated theories or more comprehensive programs, we might focus on cultivating the practical wisdom necessary for thoughtful participation in the ordinary activities through which human communities flourish. This doesn't require abandoning learning or embracing anti-intellectualism. Rather, it means recovering a proper understanding of the relationship between different forms of knowledge and their appropriate uses. The grandmother's wisdom reminds us that some of the most important truths about human life cannot be captured in textbooks but must be learned through the patient practice of living well with others.